Hello everybody, it's Chris from Military Aviation History, and I have a question for you. Why did the German Messerschmitt Me 262 carry bombs, and did the introduction of bombs on this aircraft delay the introduction of the fighter by a crucial set of months? Now, if you bundle up that question and you distill it down to a couple of keywords and then you send it into the ether on your favorite search engine on the internet, you will be presented with an answer that on the surface sounds rather convincing. And that is, of course, that upon seeing the aircraft for the first time, Hitler, in November 1943, this is a very important date throughout this video, November 1943, remember it, that upon seeing the aircraft for the first time, he explains to an astonished and surprised audience of experts that the aircraft that is presented to him as a fighter, that everybody around him seems to consider a fighter and talks about as if it was a fighter, was not in fact a fighter. It is in fact a fighter bomber, a jet bomber, a blitz bomber, a Schnell bomber, never mind how you want to cut it. This aircraft is supposed to carry bombs, in Hitler's eyes, rather than be a fighter. In this video, I will demonstrate that this popular depiction of the question whether the Me 262 was delayed due to the bombs is perhaps cutting a bit short. Now, Hitler did cause the Me 262 to veer off track slightly. I will explain more of that also in the video. But we know nowadays, thanks to, for example, a lot of primary sources that historians have been going through for the last 50 years or 60 years, that I will also use in this video. Thank you very much to all my patrons and channel members who support my trips to the German military archives as well as other archives. But we know nowadays that the situation was a lot more complex, and that the question of whether the Me 262 was supposed to have bombs cannot just be distilled down to that one singular event in November 1943. And I will demonstrate this in this video. What I'm going to do is break this down into a couple of chapters. First, we're actually going to talk about that meeting that Hitler has with the aircraft in, that's correct, November 1943. And we're going to talk about what this meeting tells us and what it doesn't tell us, which is actually the more important question, what it doesn't tell us. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the development of the Me 262, and I'm going to show to you that actually there were plans for it to carry bombs long before Hitler ever saw the aircraft. And after that, we're going to talk a little bit about the internal division of the Luftwaffe, and I'm going to show to you that there were those people in the Luftwaffe that wanted the 262 as a bomber and those that wanted it as a fighter, and these guys are going head to head. And this is actually a front line within the Luftwaffe that has existed for some years already. And then we're going to talk about the actual problems that delayed the introduction of the 262, and you're going to see that the introduction of bombs, or the question of bombs, really doesn't factor in all that much in this grand scheme of things. So let's get cracking. Before we go into this, I ran a little poll a few days ago on exactly this question to see how many people would answer whether it was the bombs that delayed the 262 or something else. By now, 5 days and 9,000 votes later, around 64% said the bombs delayed the 262. It's not a representative poll, but overall a good indication that this popular depiction is still very much relevant. Thanks everyone for taking part, and also shout out to all the Luftwaffles out there who turned this poll around on me by interpreting the bomb answer as Allied bombs. Well done indeed. Now let's break all of this down into a timeline. Those are always helpful in showing what actually happened. Now, on the 26th of November 1943, this is the date you have to remember, Hitler sees the Me 262 for the first time and calls it a blitz bomber. Now, in December 1943, series production is supposed to start, but it kicks off very, very slowly. There isn't any real production until September 1944. On the 25th of May 1944, Hitler demands the blitz bomber again, and trials with a 250 kilogram bomb and a 500 kilogram bomb commence. And then between June and July 1944, the Erprobungskommando Schenk practice bombing with their 262 and also fly this aircraft operationally. Now, looking at this in isolation, I think you'll agree with me that presented like this, it does look like Hitler is the culprit, right? But there is a fundamental problem when we focus only on Hitler's meeting with the 262 in trying to answer the question of why the aircraft was delayed. First off, we don't actually know 100% what happened. Yes, we have a good idea of what happened, but much of what we know about this meeting is based on memoirs and accounts of the time, given by people that are sometimes assumed, the way we recount the story, to be neutral spectators, which they were definitely not. We have accounts by Willy Messerschmitt, We have accounts by Albert Speer, Adolf Galland. We have Adolf Galland actually, where is it? For example, here, Die Ersten und die Letzten, the first and last. That's his book recounting his version of the event. Let me just file that back. There we go. Then we have accounts by Milch, Sauer, Göring. Göring before he hanged himself. Two important things here. These accounts differ from each other, sometimes slightly, sometimes a bit more. But they all sort of seem to point towards Hitler, right? But there is a fundamental problem with relying only on these sources, and that is that after the war, after German historians, for example, have gone through the masses of primary sources that still exist and have compiled that into very heavy German academic literature, we've shown, or I haven't shown, I shouldn't say we, but it has been shown that these memoirs and these accounts depict an interpretation of events on not just one topic, but on many topics that cannot be corroborated with the actual sources. And that is also one of the reasons why, for example, German historians are more hesitant in using these sources. One of the fundamental problems, of course, here is that the German literature and the German primary sources, only a very small fraction of that has actually been translated into another language. And that creates an artificial barrier for international historians to penetrate this knowledge, let's say, or this volume of work. If we compare that to the actual memoirs, a lot of the memoirs have been translated. And that is also why they are more accessible to international scholars rather than, the actual sources that we have in the archives in Germany. That is one of the reasons why this question, at least this is what I think, this is one of the reasons why I think this idea that Hitler delayed the Me-262 with that one single meeting in November 1943 is so predominant more on the international market than it is still in Germany. However, you have me, ich spreche Deutsch, I speak German, so I can relay some of that original documentation to you in this video and in all my other videos. Yeah, Messerschmitt, Albert Speer, Galland, all of them after the war had an interest in passing the book. That much we know. Yeah, and all of them do pass the book very quickly after the war. And the most common person to pass blame to is, of course, Hitler. Hitler has a monumental, colossal amount of blame. Yeah, I mean, if you would take the Himalayas mountain range and you would square that, there would still be room for blame for Hitler. Yeah, this guy. If we, however, look at the microcosm that is the development of the 262, things become a little bit more complicated. In that case, we do know that Hitler actually does cause the Me-262 to veer off course slightly. But we know this not because Galland tells us or because Speer tells us. We know this because we have actual documents proving this from the time. What is interesting is that Hitler had already interested himself for jet aircraft as bombers, at least for a short time before seeing the Me-262. For a long time, he had championed the position that production should not immediately switch over to jets, and at least one more generation of piston engine-driven aircraft should precede the 262. But a few days before he saw the Me-262, a presentation on jet engines in the Luftwaffe that I found in the archive includes the following notice. The Führer has occasionally issued the demand that jet bombers are to be pushed forward by all means with the use of a large quantity of small bombs to defend against an invasion in the West. In the West, the jet bomber is more important than the jet fighter. Hitler will have an infatuation with the Me-262 as a fighter bomber between November 1943 and July 1944. Soon after seeing the Me-262, he issued an order via Göring. The Führer wishes to draw our attention urgently to the enormous importance of the production of jet aircraft to be deployed as fighter bombers. It is imperative to ensure that by the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe has a sufficient number of these fighter bombers operational. Then in May 1944, after seeing the jet aircraft a few months ago, the following reminder. The Führer has ordered that the Me-262 is to be used exclusively as a Schnellsbomber. The aircraft is at present not considered as a fighter aircraft. So once again, if we look at all of what I've just shown you in isolation, then yes, it looks like bam, on that one meeting in November 1943, Hitler changes everything. It's completely unexpected. Something has happened that has drastically changed the nature of the beast. However, I'm going to explain from henceforth onwards that the introduction of bombs on the 262 was not exactly a surprise, and that it has been planned for some time. And that, I think, will allow you to look at this meeting that Hitler has with the 262, which obviously doesn't help, but you will be able to look at it in a new light. So what happens before Hitler meets the Me-262? Going back to the timeline I showed you earlier, let's start filling in the gaps. On the 4th of January 1939, die vorläufige Richtlinien für schnelle Jagdflugzeuge mit Strahlantrieb, the preliminary specifications for a jet aircraft, are drawn up. Then between June and October 1939, the BMW and UMO engines are chosen to carry this aircraft. In January 1940, 20 prototypes are ordered. Then in July 1941, the first prototypes near completion. In February 1942, 3 prototypes are still waiting for working engines, and these are delivered between March and July. And then in July 1942, the first flight is conducted with only jet engines. It is important to realize that the Me-262 at this time is not a priority. This is clearly documented in primary sources. The Me-262 is currently being tested and developed without any special urgency. In the Generalluftzeugmeisters meeting of the 16th January 1943, it was mentioned that there were no requirements for a jet fighter at the moment. From the Generalluftzeugmeisters meeting in the first months of 1943, it is clear that also from the side of the General Staff no precise specifications were made towards fuselage, jet engines and deadlines, and from the technical side no measures were taken to control development undertaken in the various companies in a more centralized capacity. In early 1943, everyone still expects a new generation of piston engine-driven aircraft to come out before Germany shifts to the jet turbine. Yes, there are calls for the jet aircraft to come out earlier, but not among those people taking the decisions. In December 1942, jets are placed at a higher priority, but nothing really happens until half a year later, in summer 1943, when the Me-262 suddenly becomes really important. Up until this point, Messerschmitt is essentially free to develop the aircraft without any real official guidance, and if we look at the weaponry, the proposals change continually, as this shortened overview will show. In June 1939, we have the first project proposal, and the weaponry chosen here are a 20mm and a 50mm cannon. In March 1940, the third draft proposal is presented, featuring 3 Mk108s. Then in July 1942, the first trial flights are conducted, and with these flights, a renewed emphasis is placed on the weaponry, with the testing of the eventual implementation of an expected range of tasks and/or testing of future variants, including weaponry. In August 1942, there is a provisional agreement with the Ministry of Aviation on prototypes. At this point, the plane is still considered a fighter, and the weaponry is either an MG151 or an Mk103. Then in March 1943, there is an agreement with the Ministry of Aviation on the series production, and here the Me-262 is called a fighter bomber. The weaponry is supposed to be 4 Mk108s and 2 MG151-20s or 6 Mk108s. Included in the agreement is also the carrying capacity for a single 500 kg bomb. Hang on, is that March 1943, 8 full months before Hitler sees the actual aircraft? Yes it is, and this is why I love primary sources. From this moment on, spring 1943, Messerschmitt, or the Messerschmitt Design Bureau, but certainly within the knowledge of Messerschmitt, is planning an introduction of bombs on the 262. And this becomes very obvious. It is given in project proposals that they send to the OKL and the RLM, so the OKL, Oberkommando der Luftwaffe, RLM, Reichsluftfahrtministerium, Ministry of Aviation, whether they're giving examples for pre-series production or for series production. We, for example, have in Project Overview Stage 2 from the 25th of March 1943, we have the proposal to carry one single SC 500 kg bomb, or 2 SC 250 kg bomb, or in fact a BT 700. What is a BT 700, you might ask? Well, they were planning to have the potential carrying capacity on the 262, or the carrying ability of the 262 for a torpedo. We also then, for example, have project proposal number 4 from the same time, which already calls the Me-262 not just as a fighter anymore, which in the planning until now it has been just called a fighter, but it also calls it a fighter bomber. In September 1943, there is a construction proposal by Messerschmitt giving an overview of the different variants of aircraft the company proposes. There's the Aufklärer 1 and 2, those are recon aircraft, carrying Jumo engines and using the RB 7530 and 3030, those are cameras. Then there is the Schnellbomber 1 and 2, these are also using Jumo engines and they're mainly armed with bombs. Then we have the Interceptor 1 bis 3, using different engines and armed with up to 6 Mk108s. And then we have the Schulflugzeug, a trainer aircraft, also using Jumo engines, armed with 4 Mk108s. Then in early November 1943, Göring visits Messerschmitt and talks about the fighter bomber use of the Me-262. 3 days later, the Technical Development Department at Junkers acknowledges that the engines are not yet ready, something again confirmed at the end of the year. All of what you've just seen happens before Hitler has actually seen the aircraft in its current state. So what is going on? Why is this happening? Well, this is because a notice goes out in February 1943 to the industry that says, from now on, any fighter that the RLM and the OKL are going to accept are going to be required to carry a bomb. Every fighter plane that is being developed needs to be fighter bomber capable. And this is also, for example, something that clouds or that influences the choice of the Luftwaffe, or not just the choice of the Luftwaffe in choosing what aircraft they're going to implement or introduce rather, but also how they're going to grade and judge fighter proposals and fighter concepts. For example, if you've seen this video on the Italian planes of World War II and the late war Italian planes like the Fiat G55 and so on, and the Germans' opinion on them, they criticize these aircraft for not even being able to carry a bomb. Now you can see how that aspect clouds their judgment, or not really clouds their judgment, but influence against their judgment of these aircraft. Why is this happening? This is something that is a little bit complicated. Now, I can tell you why it is happening. That's because of the Ostfront, the Eastern Front. Yeah? The combat experience over there shows that ever more and more fighter bombers become the only means of delivering close air support to the army in the offensive. Well, by mid-1943, that's really not happening anymore. That's sort of the last really offensive operation that the Germans are planning there. But from then on, it's also going to be defensive. But that's the only way of really getting air support to the troops on the ground. That is why fighter bombers. These have the speed and, let's say, the overall accuracy also required for the job. That we know. And this is also something that is mentioned, for example, in a discussion between Göring and some of his subordinates on this topic. The Reichsmarschall points out that bomb drops may be required on all fighter aircraft on the Eastern Front. What is a little bit more difficult to ascertain is the relationship this change towards the fighter bomber has with the actual planning of the war. I'm not quite sure whether this is something that the RLM, so the Ministry of Aviation, or the OKL, the Oberkommando der Luftwaffe, have planned together and have developed themselves, or whether this is something that is mandated at a higher level. It could be that this is mandated by the OKW, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, because the army has been asking, the OKH, the Oberkommando des Heeres, this is going to get complicated very quickly, has demanded that more air support is delivered, and then that instead of being sent horizontally, that is sent vertically up to the OKW, and then the OKW with Hitler tells the OKL, hey, we need more air support, what do you have? Fighter bombers, does that work for you? And the OKL would be like, yeah, that works for us. Or maybe this is something that is proposed organically in the OKL, which I think is actually more likely that the OKL has developed this themselves, and this is sanctioned off at a higher level by just saying, okay, so you have fighters, now you're making fighter bombers out of them. Does that allow you to get the job done? Yes, it does. Okay, so let's do that. In that sense, you can of course say that Hitler is involved because he's sanctioning this change. But that's a discussion that really goes into the nitty-gritty, and I can't really ascertain at the moment with the sources that I have. It is thus obvious why Messerschmitt had these proposals and plans. He knew he needed them for the Me-262 to be accepted in the first place. We also have further proof in that the Me-262 was already planned to have some bomb-carrying capacity by returning to the presentation I cited from earlier, from the 18th of November 1943. The talks between the Reichsmarschall and Messerschmitt have shown that the Me-262 has the ability to carry bombs. The use of bombs was already considered in the planning, plans and drawings exist, thus this will not generate any difficulties. Me-262 fighter, high-altitude fighter. Effective Reichsair defense aircraft against 4-engined high-altitude aircraft. Next to this, use as a fighter bomber for close air support. A use is considered especially to defend against an invasion. That a jet bomber could help in case of an invasion is something that pops up throughout late 1943 and early 1944. In this light, more people than just Hitler already considered the Me-262 to be a possible choice for this jet bomber, as can be seen in the minutes of a meeting a few days before Hitler seized the actual aircraft. As the use of bombs on the fighter Me-262 was already considered in the planning, and this operational condition is given, then an urgent production of this type can also meet the demand of the Führer that a jet aircraft is needed for bombing against ground and naval targets around the coast, without that the shift in urgency between a jet fighter to a jet bomber impairs the development or production. That last one was a good one. No? That's literally the Germans saying that a shift in production from the fighter to the fighter bomber, or a partial shift, is not going to impair production. Actually, if you think about it, yeah, of course not. I mean, all you have to do is add a couple of more pylons, lay a couple of different electric wires, put in a different control system for the bombs to set them in the actual aircraft, and that's it. You've got yourself a fighter bomber. That's a field modification that you can even make, which doesn't really take all that much time. And that really shows us that this apparent surprise that everybody has around Hitler when he explains that this is a bomber and not a fighter seems a little bit far-fetched, because these people knew it was coming. They didn't just knew it was coming. Some of them were actively planning for it, including Messerschmitt and the design bureau surrounding him. The presentation that you've just been shown, the source that I've just quoted from, I mean, that was a presentation that happened 8 days before Hitler saw the aircraft. So they knew there was already something in the works. They were planning for this. All these people might have had private reservations. They might have thought that it was a silly idea, but as you will see, it wasn't just Hitler that wanted bombs on the Me-262. What's important to realize here is that the Luftwaffe is split into two factions. You have the offensive faction and you have the defensive faction, and they are split primarily by the type of aircraft they're operating, they're flying. The offensive faction, which I'm also going to call the bomber faction, but I'll have to explain that a little bit more. They are the ones that fly the bomber aircraft. They are the ones that also fly the dive bombers, and also, although not as important initially, and then later on it becomes more important, the fighter bombers. And the fighter bombers, you always have to put a little asterisk on them because their status is a little bit unclear. I hesitate to call them the bomber faction because that, in our minds, that creates this image of, you know, heavy bombers, strategic bombing, and so on and so forth. That's not what the Luftwaffe really considers important here. And then you have the defensive faction, which fly, you've guessed it, fighters. The defensive faction, very simple. They are only supposed, the Luftwaffe only considers them important for air defense and to escort the bomber faction. Yeah. In the bomber faction, you have the Kampfgeschwader, the bomber wings, the Sturzkampfgeschwader, as I said, in the fighter bombers. These guys, the reason why they're so important since 1935, since the Luftwaffe was actually created. They're the most influential group in here. And why are they so influential? Because the Luftwaffe considers them to be the ones that actually get the job done. Yeah? They have schlachtentscheidende Wirkung, battle-deciding effects. They are able to strike on the Hauptkampffeld or Hauptgefechtsfeld or on the Gefechtsfeld, which are two different things. Yeah? So within, let's say, from the front line to 50 kilometers behind the front line, or 50 to 150 kilometers before the front line. This is the target area that the Luftwaffe has. And these are the aircraft that are supposed to assist the army in their offensive thrusts. The fighters cannot assist the army. I mean, what are you going to do? Strafe a couple of dugouts, maybe, instead of bombing them? You can see, you know, the value that is being attributed here as a sort of force that, operationally speaking, considers itself to be able to support the army directly on long and fast offensive thrusts deep into enemy territory. And this is why the bomber faction is so important. Of course, this changes as the war progresses. But even by, let's say, 1941, 1942, the bomber faction are still the most influential guys out there. Yeah, let me paint you a picture here. If you were part of the bomber faction and you come to the OKL or the Ministry of Aviation in 1941, 1942, and you stand in front of their massive gate, it will be open for you, a red carpet will be rolled out, somebody will thrust a glass of champagne into your hand, people will make small talk, people want to be your friend, they ask you what is your handicap in golf, how many goals you have scored in the last match against, I don't know, Eintracht Frankfurt. And Eintracht Frankfurt, did they already exist at that point? I don't know. Anyway, that's a detail. And that's how you're going to be treated. If you're a fighter pilot, on the other hand, you'll have to you'll have to come in the back entrance and you'll be treated like a peasant. That's just how it's going to be. Nowadays, we have this concept or this image of the Luftwaffe, of these fighter pilots, that they were the important ones and they were the ones that everybody looked up to. And yes, propaganda to a point actually amplified more what the fighter pilots were doing, the aces, rather than what the Kampfgeschwader or the Stutzkampfgeschwader were doing, although these also featured very heavily in the early war propaganda. But you have to make a distinction between sort of the popular image that is also amplified by propaganda that has been attributed to a certain sub-faction within the Luftwaffe and the actual organizational importance that these guys carried. And you can see a vast imbalance until sort of mid-1943 between these two factions. And it's only in mid-1943 when really Germany starts going more or planning more to go into the defensive that we see an actual change occur. And even then, it takes until like mid-1944 for there to be radical changes in the thinking. And the bomber faction starts to lose out drastically here, and the fighter faction, also because they start to organize themselves a little bit more within the OKL, they start to rise up. However, what is important also to realize here is that while the bomber faction is sort of waning and losing out in influence over the fighters, overall, the planning that the Germans have here in order to prop up the fighters and allow more, Reichsair defense and so on and so forth, they consider this only to be a temporary means to an end rather than a strategic necessity. In the jet aircraft controversy between Hitler and the Luftwaffe, the latter did not immediately stand on the side of the fighter version. Not just Hitler championed the bomber version, but important Luftwaffe officers called for it in 1943, as the use of bombs had already been considered in the planning of the aircraft. Have a look at this graph detailing aircraft production in each indicated month, split between offensive and defensive aircraft. This is essentially a split between Kampfflugzeuge, for example bombers or dive bombers on the offensive side, and fighters on the defensive side. The shift to strategic defense came far too late. Only from 1943 onwards did the defensive-oriented production become predominant, but only with the introduction of the fighter staff to force the production of fighter aircraft beginning in March 1944 did a perceivable increase in fighter aircraft occur. Milch first wanted to make air defense effective so that, after this, the natural order of things with a focus on the attack could be re-established. There's also a fascinating discussion on this in the Ministry of Aviation in May 1943 that also shows this dynamic. Hermann: it is of course a question of fundamental importance if this aircraft is to be designed only as a fighter or only as a bomber. Generalluftzeugmeister Milch: this question is absolutely justified. We will first do it as a fighter, and in the moment when we see that it runs smoothly, we will also find something for your needs. We are not interested in only fighting with fighters. Ants: carrying a 500 kg bomb as a fighter bomber has already been examined from a construction standpoint. There are many people within the Luftwaffe that champion the introduction of a jet bomber. And the discussion whether this should be the Me-262 or the Arado 234, for example, is actually a detail. After all, if you look at Germany's bomber faction, what planes do they have in 1943 that are still effective on the front lines? I mean, the Stukas are useless by this point, and the bombers that the Germans have, well, they were designed for a type of war where Germany is on the offensive, where Germany has air superiority, where Germany is able to push the initiative and push the air campaigns in such a manner that is beneficial to them, rather than to be on the receiving end. And on the receiving end, the planes that Germany has at this point, the bomber planes that Germany has, are not really doing all that well. And to make matters worse, and this is actually a crucial point, there's nothing really lined up in the conventional type of aircraft around this time that seems to be future-proof. And then suddenly a jet aircraft appears, and you can already see the bomber faction being there like, wait a second, this jet plane gives us new capabilities. It's fast, it probably won't be intercepted by enemy fighters, flak will be less of an issue. If we can only have a couple of bombs on that thing, we can call it a bomber, and then we'll be relevant again. And that's why they want a jet bomber. And whether that's the Me-262 or the Arado 234, whatever comes first, they will want to take it. Does this, of course, mean that the Me-262 is already being tested as being a fighter bomber or a bomber, whatever? No. Even by the time that Hitler has met the aircraft, even though it's been planned to carry bombs or have that bomb-carrying capability, it has not yet been tested as such. But it really doesn't been tested as a fighter either. There's been already a lot of flight testing going on, but there will have to be more flight testing actually to make sure that the aircraft is up to the task. And here is, I think, the reason why this idea that Hitler had such fundamental influence on the development of the 262 becomes so persuasive, because he, of course, meets the aircraft in November 1943. Yet the first tests to see if the aircraft can actually carry bomb, not the planning stage where they were designing the pylons and drawing them up and so on and so forth and doing the calculations, but the actual testing happens in May 1944. And that is 6 months after his meeting. So again, on the surface it appears, oh well, Hitler said that, and then 6 months later they're testing it. That means the plane delayed by 6 months. No, the plane is delayed anyway. The plane is not ready in November, and it's actually not even ready in May 1944. And in fact, the plane in May 1944, where it is being tested for the first time to carry bombs, they start with 250 kilogram bombs, then with 500 kilogram bombs. At that point, it is already also being tested as a fighter. There's only a portion of the early pre-series production that is being siphoned off towards the fighter bomber stage. Of course, throughout this time, Hitler presses more and more to see a jet bomber. He wants a jet bomber. There's a couple of notices that go out, a couple of orders that go out from Hitler via Goering to say, hey, get this plane ready to do bombs. But the plane itself isn't ready yet. And that really is the crucial factor. It's not that the Germans overly engineered a bomb pylon along 6 months in order to get it ready. That is not the case. A bomb pylon is not that difficult to produce. What is more crucial is that the engines aren't ready yet, that the actual finalized design for the 262, what goes into the fuselage, what systems are in there, where are the oxygen bottles, what sort of weaponry are we going to put on the aircraft, has not been finalized at this stage either. All of that really only starts coming together in September 1944, so a couple of months after the aircraft is being tested with bombs and tested as a fighter, and essentially a year after Hitler sees it. It's only at this point that the plane really starts to get ready for production. And much of this has to do, of course, with the actual aircraft, but the majority of this has to do with the engine. Again, we return to the timeline. In December 1943 to the January 1944, Messerschmitt receives the first Jumo 004 engines. In March 1944, series production starts slowly. As you can see, until May, barely more than 20 aircraft are actually completed. In April 1944 then, with the few aircraft that are available, the Erprobungskommando Thierfelder tests the Me-262 as a fighter aircraft, also in combat. It's only after this, in May 1944, that fighter bomber trials commence, with a 250 kilogram bomb. Until July 1944, of course, the fighter bomber trials continue, with pilots from Kampfgeschwader 51 testing and using the Me-262 as a fighter bomber in the Erprobungskommando Schenk. This also sees small-scale operational use and is largely unsuccessful. Then in September 1944, the Luftwaffe accepts the Me-262 as a fighter with some reservations. The aircraft cannot be certified with an unrestricted operational readiness. The engines, the weapons, and the gear are the primary cause for complaint. So by September 1944, the series production of the aircraft starts kicking off, and it kicks off very slowly. I'll put in a graph at some point in this video and then you'll see. And the reason why it is not yet fully operational at this point, well, there's a couple of reasons. I already alluded to them. First one, the plane design is not yet fully matured. Then the engines are not yet ready for production, and the production of both the engines and the aircraft kick off very slowly. Actually, refer to an older video on that case. I explain everything there. And then there's, of course, there's the lack of conversion training for pilots that is really hampering the introduction. And this is not just a problem initially with the series production. This is already a problem since the start of 1944, where the first testing is done with fighter planes and fighter bombers, and also the first operational missions are being flown, that there are very few pilots that actually are being trained to convert to the 262, because the training facilities and the training methods is a bit difficult. Yeah, you actually already need to have pilots who are very experienced in order to jump into a 262, because there are no trainer aircraft available. But let's say we're in September 1944 and we have the introduction of the aircraft. And if somebody is now typing already in the comments with saying, hey, fuel is an issue. Yes, fuel starts becoming an issue, and also the pilots actually start becoming an issue once production of the aircraft has kicked off. But this is only happening now in September 1944. So once the aircraft is actually introduced into the Luftwaffe and is available as a fighter or a fighter bomber, if you want to call it like that. Actually, it never really becomes introduced into the Luftwaffe as a fighter bomber. That was only for testing. Then fuel and the pilots really start becoming an issue. Before that, it's production and the engines. And those are the main factors hampering the introduction of the 262. Of all the aircraft that are being built, of all the fuselages that are being built, only about a third, and that is roughly 500 aircraft, actually are completed. That means that the aircraft is completed and the engines are attached to it. And of those 500, roughly 250 to 300, we don't really have exact numbers on this, so this is a little bit speculation on my part, become operational. That means they are sent to the front lines and they fly at least, an operational mission or something like that. Of course, the implementation of bombs and the siphoning off of a small number of 262s that would have been critical for the early testing or the early operational testing of the aircraft didn't help. That did cause additional problems. But it's not to say that this caused a delay in the aircraft. As a basic comparison, what does it matter if you're being told to produce fighter bombers instead of fighters if you don't even have production facilities able to build the aircraft in the first place? What does it matter if you're being told to build fighter bombers instead of fighters if the engines that you're supposed to build aren't yet ready for mass production? What does it matter if you're being told to build fighter bombers instead of fighters if you yourself don't even have completed plans of the aircraft that you want to build in the first place? Those were the critical issues with the 262. The project, once it was started to appear, once it started being put into production, was barely ready for the introduction. So the bombs, yes, they created an additional problem, but they were not the ones that delayed the 262. The 262 delayed itself. The decision by Hitler to equip the Me-262 as a Schnellbomber will only have had a marginal influence on production. The first sorties of the Me-262 were in a fighter configuration. The rapidly deteriorating situation ended in the result that the question of the Schnellbomber resolved itself. I hope all of you enjoyed this video, and if you are a Patreon or a channel member, check the updates on the relevant pages, as I am sharing some original documentation on the Me-262 and also the timeline here as an exclusive thank you to all of you. As always, I hope all of you have a great day and see you in the sky.